Hi, I'm Dr. Andy Hemmings from the Oscilla Research Institute, and today I'd like to speak briefly and sort of at a general overview of what the Pleistocene or Ice Age environment of Florida looked like, particularly focusing on North Florida. The last glacial maximum, when the greatest amount of water was held as ice, was about 22,000 years ago. Florida would have been about double the size it is right now, and places like Pittsburgh, New York, Chicago would have had between as much as 2 miles of ice, maybe a mile, mile and a half of ice sitting on top of Chicago. The Bears games were really short then. Minnesota in the same ballpark, more than a mile of ice. The ice was so thick and so stable that soil dust accumulated on the top, and in some places there were patchy little forests growing in dirt that had accumulated 2 miles up, 12,000 feet more, or 10,000 feet up above modern ground surface, that it was that stable. What does that mean to us here in Florida? It means that the coast along Jefferson, Taylor, Wakulla County would not have been where it is today, but in some places would have been close to 200 miles away. That at 22,000 years ago, around 400 feet of water is how much it's dropped. So where the 400-foot mark is now would have been the shore at 22,000 years ago. And there's a really interesting phenomenon. Everybody knows about the continental shelf and why when you go out, you could walk miles off Cedar Key or off of anywhere in the shore in the Big Bend area. You can walk miles because the water is getting deeper at about the rate of 1 foot per 1 mile. And it does that for a long ways out there. But then it drops faster on the continental slope. And what's really important is that on the slope is where the water shoreline was 22,000 years ago. And when water starts to come out of the ice and there's meltwater pulses all over the world, that water starts to rise. But what's interesting for Florida is that in, say, 6,000 years, so you get to about 16,000 years ago, right about the time we think people are arriving here, Florida has shrunk. If you imagine that here's modern Florida, we double it at 22,000 years ago. 6,000 years later, Florida has shrunk from the massive Pleistocene landscape to here. It's still over 95% the same size, because what's happened is, even though water's come up about 120 feet vertical, horizontally, not even 10 miles. Which is kind of incredible if you think about it. When the first people arrive, all these plants and animals that rearrange their communities or go extinct, or in the case of like the horse that leaves the New World, it still survives, but it's not here anymore. All of that is happening at the time people arrive, and the landscape is still, comparatively for Florida, it's gigantic compared to what we think of today. What we have for modern isn't reached until maybe 6,000 years ago, and we actually get a slosh. If you think about when you're filling the bathtub or a pool or something, and the water comes in, water sloshes back and comes back again, that's essentially what happened. And it rose about 3 feet higher than it is today at around 5,000 years ago, and then settled back maybe 4,500 years ago to what we view as modern. So modern Florida, with air quotes to indicate that it's continually moving, modern Florida has only lasted for about 4,500 years. And of course, it's still changing, and for a myriad of reasons, and we could discuss those for the rest of our lives. But the point is, when people get here, Florida, the landscape, the available water, the available plants and animals is a very alien world. And we just don't think of it that way anymore, because how many people worried about saber cats chasing you on your way to school? Or when you came out of the store, did you look behind in case mama mastodon and baby mastodon, you'd parked between them and now you're in trouble? No, and of course not. We don't think that way, and we wouldn't need to, but the way we behave today would not have been a good idea in the Pleistocene. You probably wouldn't really last a day. So a couple of really interesting things. You probably know, if you know anything about Florida, that most of the first magnitude springs, all the big sinkholes that well up like Wakulla, that have massive amounts of fresh water boiling out of them, are within about 10 miles of the coast. There's a reason for that. Salt water is heavier and denser than fresh, which floats on top of it. And when you drop the coastline like that, all the fresh water would have dropped considerably. So the Oscilla, the Apalachicola, the Swanee that we think of today may have had a stream's worth of trickle through it, and in rainy seasons potentially be flowing rivers, but nothing like what you think of now. They would have been very high and dry. If you think of much of the Swanee now, until you get well north, is under 50 feet of elevation. At that time it would have been, and I'm saying, say 15,000 years ago, it probably would have been on the order of 250, 300 feet above sea level. And the fresh water available at the surface of the ground that we have everywhere in all these giant swamps across Florida doesn't exist. It's much lower, and if you want water, you go out on that coast, because the first magnitude springs and the abundant surficial aquifer, is what you call it, is out near that coast. So that creates a new problem. Yeah, it's great. It's nice living out there. You can, if you want to use marine resources, if people are going to eat oysters, go fishing, all of that. The evidence for people doing that when they first arrive 15, 16, 20,000 years ago is way out there and very deep. But when that water starts rising, it's time to go. And we did a number of surveys out there and got to dive some very deep sites, up to almost 130 feet, a number of years ago, and got to actually look at some of what the landscape looked like out there, 100 miles, 125 miles offshore. I sat down and longhand did the math to figure this out. On average, from 22,000 years ago until roughly 5,000 years ago, the sea level starts rising, and there's fits and starts. We have a period called the Younger Dryas, where things get cold and revert to almost a full glacial, but only situation, but only for a few hundred years. And so sea level dropped a little bit, but so there's wiggles, fits and starts. But on average, from 22,000 to 5,000 years ago, vertically, the ocean comes up 10 centimeters, or about 4 inches. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but you do that year after year after year, it really starts to matter. And when I talked about how the slope is much steeper than the continental shelf, for a long time it doesn't really matter. But when that water level breaches the edge of the continental shelf, it starts to run horizontal. Again, staying with 10 centimeter a year rise, when you hit the continental shelf, that means horizontally you're losing, on average, 151 feet. So what that means is 5 years after we camped out there, now it's 5 years later, it's 750 feet offshore. It may only be 2 feet deep, but you're not walking out there. And remember 10 years ago when Grandpa was, you get the idea that at a human scale, 10 centimeters sounds like not much, but 150 feet horizontal is a very big deal. It'll impact people in 2 other ways that you might not think of initially. First off, that fresh water that's floating on top of the salt water is now rising farther inland. There's the pull to get to the water initially, and at all times, it pulls you out towards that coast. But the push is, we're going to be sleeping in the water if we don't get moving. That's also going to affect the animal communities, and if you guess wrong and end up on a place that ends up as an island, like say the Florida Middle Grounds, the top of those are probably islands. And I admit readily that some geologists and biologists will argue about whether they really are islands or not, but I've dove them and I think they're islands. The being trapped on an island, though, can be bad in terms of long-term viability of a population of any given animals or plants. And I think that's one thing we probably do see, is that if the animals guess wrong, or if the plants just get unlucky and land, are trying to survive in a place that goes under saltwater, it's done. So you have the push and that's pushing all of the animals, all of the plants, and all of the people that are out on that landscape. And what's really interesting is that at a certain point, it concentrates everybody in what was double Florida, the modern Florida, and they become archaeologically visible, which means we don't know how many people were here 15,000, potentially 20,000 years ago. They're probably in few enough numbers initially, which are obviously growing over time, that those sites in places that nobody's really ever been able to get to at 200 feet, 300 feet underwater, we're just not going to find them right away. And across the rest of the landscape that's still land, dry today, we don't see them until they're concentrated enough for the population to pop up. That if there's only one site, the chances of us finding it on land or the earliest site on land are very unlikely. So the effects, not just who is alive, plant and animal wise, on that landscape, where is the water available, but then how it's all changing and how humans, certainly sticking with the idea of archaeology and anthropology, of how do people, when do people get here, how do they survive, how do they thrive, what resources can they use at any given time, and then how do they respond when there's changes, when there's no more mammoths, there's no more bison, there's no more horse or paleolama, for example. Or some of the plants too are really interesting. Two of my favorite, I have an unfinished atlatl and a complete atlatl made from two plants that are no longer considered to be native to Florida. But in the Pleistocene, they were here. This is one of the viburnums. They're introduced. Viburnum's a bush that is used as an ornamental all over the place now. But this is actually from, this one's from Texas, but there was a viburnum that was native to Florida, as was this beautiful wood, Osage orange, bodark. And how do we know this? Seeds of viburnum and Osage orange were found in the stomach deposits of a mastodon with nice big crunchy teeth at a site in the Osceola River called Page-Ladson. The seeds are from a layer that dates to about 14,500 years ago, maybe a hair earlier than that. Like I said, they were the stomach contents of a mastodon that was probably eating them locally. They weren't moving around enough to have a meal in Georgia and bring it here. So the only evidence for these plants comes from a mastodon at a site that has the first people in Florida that we don't argue about. We're pretty comfortable, most archaeologists accept the fact that at 14,550 years ago, we have people at Page-Ladson in the Osceola. And of course, they didn't land there in a helicopter, so they had to come from somewhere, so it's not going to be unlikely to be the first site in Florida, let alone in the southeast. So we know that when Osage orange, viburnum, mastodons, and all those other animals that I've mentioned were all alive in Florida, in the Osceola drainage, even right at Page-Ladson, they were all available and would have been seen and probably utilized by the first people into the area, which is a really interesting way to look at how dramatic the sweep of change is. And I could do a whole series of talks about what happens afterwards when the big animals go extinct and people have to eat different things, make their clothes from different things, and make their tools from different things. And we'll get into some of that in another video. But the point here is these people were profoundly affected by their environment, especially if they're anywhere near the coast, because the available surface water on that shrinking landscape is constantly moving. The plants and animals that are thriving or surviving on that landscape are constantly moving for thousands and thousands of years. And the way we think of sedentism today, that we stay in a place, we want our cities to stay in a place, is very, very different than the mindset and the behavior of people that are forced to move every year because 4 inches of water comes and moves the whole camp 200 feet that way every year. So anyway, it would be a great place to look at thinking about how change today is affecting us now, because there's some really dramatic examples right here from long, long ago. Thank you.